Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome all of you to today's Asset Colloquium. And this particular colloquium is going to be is being organized by the TIFR Committee for Gender Harmony, which is called TCGH for short, and is also being co-hosted by TIFR centers, namely CBS, HBCSC, TIFR Hyderabad, and NCRA. So welcome Professor Vaishnavi Ananthanarayanan from University of New South Wales, Sydney. She's going to talk today on BiasWatchIndia, an initiative to document gender bias in Indian STEM academia and conferences. So without taking more of the time of the speaker, let me invite Professor Sandhya Kaushika, the chair of the TCGH, to formally introduce today's speaker and also conduct the rest of the proceedings. Over to Sandhya.
Thank you, Satya. I just thought I'll give a small preamble as to how this talk comes about. Next Friday is actually International Women in Science Day. And there isn't a single day in which, special groups of people should be highlighted, but it gives us an opportunity to take a pause in our everyday scientific endeavors, which everybody in TIFR is engaged in, to think about larger issues that affect science and people in science. Scientific talent is, as far as we know, not restricted to any one group. And women happen to be a large underrepresented minority in many areas of science, in fact, in all of science. There are other underrepresented minorities, but since I am part of the gender cell, and this is one of our mandates, and certainly women form a large underrepresented minority, it is worthwhile looking at information, looking at data to see how far have we come, how much further do we need to go, what are the barriers for entry, continued progress, and success. And this benefits not only all of us as a society, but also large benefits science. And it's something that I think we all care very deeply about. I'm going to say a few words about Vaishnavi, and I'm going to start off introducing her actually as a scientist. She probably does not know this, but I heard her talk in an ACB meeting, which is the premier meeting for cell biologists, when she was a graduate student, where she talked about her work on dynein, and it was absolutely wonderful, stunning work that she had done. She went on directly from a PhD in Max Planck Dresden and started a faculty career and started a lab in Indian Institute of Science, and has done really well, publishing in really good places, including PNAS. Was spotlighted as by Journal of Cell Science as a scientist to watch. She was a EMBO Young Investigator from India, and more recently has been awarded the very prestigious ASCB Junior Award for Excellence in Research. So as a scientist, she has been wonderful. And what she did was something very unusual. Most people who are at that stage build on their career, build on what are their, what are clear goals for their own research endeavors. And she decided to spend some of her own grant money from the EMBO and a considerable energy talking about and getting data on what the gender imbalances are in India. She started this effort with Shruti Muralidhar, who was a postdoc at that time at MIT, and has continued to document the information through BiasWatchIndia, which they started jointly, as well as to mentioned places where panels and meetings have very little representation, if sometimes no representation from women. Given that we are looking at underrepresented minorities and to be inclusive, the Gender Cell at TIFR is co-hosting this talk with NCBS, Homi Bhabha Science Education Center, which has a group which specifically looks at gender in scientific areas, NCRA and TIFR Hyderabad, to bring her work in this domain to our audience here today. So the floor is to you, Vaishnavi, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I should say that not that long ago, maybe about a year or so ago, Vaishnavi moved from ISC to EMBO Australia and is now, I think, some sort of position with EMBO as well as University of New South Wales. So welcome, Vaishnavi. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandhya, for that extremely kind introduction. And thanks for the invitation to speak at this forum. I'm honored to be here. I'll start sharing my screen now. Do let me know if you don't see it. Should
we see it, Vaishnavi.
Oh,
looks
great.
good. Yeah.
Great. So, like I said, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today about BiasWatch India, an initiative that's very close to my heart. Like Sandhya mentioned, the co-founder is Shruti Muralidhar. So what is BiasWatch India? So as Sandhya also mentioned in an introduction, so BiasWatch India is an initiative that we founded in 2020, June 2020 to be precise, to highlight the lack of women representation and gender imbalance in Indian STEM academia, and also specifically talks, conferences, workshops, and panels. We started in June 2020. And in fact, this came about as a result of a tweet that I saw from Shruti around that time, where she had quote tweeted something from BiasWatch Neuro, which is an initiative like BiasWatch India. They started first, of course, but for the neuroscience field. So she quote tweeted that tweet from BiasWatch Neuro and asked, can we do something of this sort for Indian academia? And I was one of the people that said, sure, we should definitely be able to do this. And we got talking, and BiasWatch India essentially was born out of the frustration at seeing lack of Indian women experts on high-level panels in Indian academia. And that's Shruti right there. She's now in Canada. She's moved from MIT to Canada now. So the question is, why is it important for us to do what we're doing? So Indian science, as a lot of us in the audience know, does have a dearth of women voices and representation. And women scientists are regularly excluded from science conferences and panels, and also awards, as we've seen in recent years. So BiasWatch India was formed to highlight these inequities and to provide real-time actionable data as a basis for future remedial steps. And I'll be showing you all the data that we've collected thus far in a little bit. Our mission is to increase the awareness of manals. Manals are those conferences and speaker lineups that feature no women speakers, to document the lack of women representation in STEM fields and Indian academia, and to provide up-to-date data on base rates for future policy making, like I mentioned previously. So I'll talk about base rates in just a bit. But one of our another mission of ours is to actually empower students and academics to call out manals when they actually see them. So to jump right into data collection, how do we do what we do? So we pretty much rely on our Twitter feed, our Twitter followers, or we do a simple search, web search, to figure out conferences that are being conducted in Indian academia and Indian STEM fields. And since we started in the midst of a pandemic, most things have been virtual. And so it's been pretty easy for us to find conference notifications on social media. We typically come across posters such as the one on the right over here. This was a conference that was conducted sometime in 2020. And what we do is essentially go through a speaker list and identify women of the entire lineup, from the entire lineup. And here we get a women speaker ratio, which is in this case 6 out of 18, which is 0.33 or 33%. So this is the women speaker ratio for the specific conference. But for this number to make any sense, we need to compare this against the proportion of women in Indian academia. And initially, we thought this would be a number that we could easily get from any of the websites that the funding agencies have or the government of India has. But this is surprisingly a hard number to come by. And so what we decided to do was to just do this ourselves. We defined the base rate as the number of women scientists or faculty members to the total number of scientists or faculty members. And we do this by field of research or for all of Indian science. For instance, in our first pass, we went through the major institutes such as IST, TIFR as well. And what we did was to actually just go to the websites of these institutes and go through individual departments and look for women faculty members in their roster. And we accounted for biology, chemistry, and all these other fields, and also science overall. So as you can imagine, this is a tedious process. And oftentimes the data is not where you think it would be. There's different ways of reporting the data. So we had to make decisions on how we were going to actually collect this data. And this information of how we collected the data is also available on our website. I urge you to check it out. But essentially what we did was to collect base rates of women scientists in Indian academia. And this is what the data looks like. So we've actually crossed 100 institutes. I just haven't been able to put them in a plot that looks like this yet. But this is for 97 top ranked Indian universities and institutes surveyed. We have split this by field, like I mentioned previously, biology, chemistry, computer science, and so on. And this is the number for all of Indian science, putting together everything that we've seen from all institutes. And what you're looking at here.
Sorry, Vaishnavi, you got muted.
Yeah, I think somebody muted me. Sorry. What was the last thing? Okay, I'll just repeat what I just said. So essentially, we have been looking at 97 top-ranked Indian institutes here. The way we're looking at this data now is to look at it by field. For instance, biology here, we had, of the 97 institutes that we looked at, 46 had biology departments. So we went through the websites and got data on the proportion of women scientists in that particular department. And each of these data points represents an institute. The median is the white circle here. And this number here, 0.26 or 26%, is the base rate of women in biology in Indian academia. So too, we have a base rate for chemistry, which is 11%, computer science is 12, earth science is 14, engineering is 9, and that's the lowest we have. Math is 16%, physics is 13%, and for all of Indian science, the number stands at around 13%. This may not be shocking to many, but it still is quite jarring to see a number that as low as that. Biology, of course, has the highest base rates, as is evident from this plot here, and others have similar base rates ranging from 9% to 16% for engineering. For math. So overall, the base rate is 13%. So how does this compare against the rest of the world? So this is a plot, or this is essentially a map of proportion of women scientists by country, of course, and you can see that the proportions are listed here. India is between 0 to 30%. In fact, I have numbers coming up in the next slide. But as you could see here, this is comparison with actually African countries and Asian countries, Asia Pacific countries. In fact, India is down here around 13.9%. This is from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics data, which is actually matches quite well with what we have seen as well. So that's heartening. But what's not heartening is the proportion itself, which is quite low, and in fact, among the lowest in Asia, certainly. So also, we are able to compare field-specific base rates with, I was able to get data for the United States and the UK. I'm sure for other countries it is available, but if you just compare against the United States and the UK, you see that India fares quite a bit poorly compared to both of these countries. So biology has almost 50% representation in the higher education space in the UK and United States, whereas in India, it's only about 26%. And overall, this is what it looks like. It's consistently lower in representing women in every single field that we've looked at. And in fact, if you look at the entire world, the average proportion of women in science as a whole is about 28%. And like I showed you a couple of slides ago, for India, it is 13%. So we're obviously doing poorly compared to the rest of the world. So this is one of our data collection activities, but remember, initially we wanted to actually just look at the proportion of women in Indian STEM conferences. So where is that data? We have actually been able to, we've been documenting several more conferences, but this is data from 293 conferences that were held between June 2020 and August 2021. And the numbers here represent the numbers of conferences that fit into the theme mentioned below. So biology, we had about 135 conferences. This was, of course, the most represented. The others had numbers of conferences ranging from 10 to 54 for general science. So science here indicates general science conferences, which had a mix of all the fields that have been indicated here. In red here, the bar is actually the base rate for that field that we saw previously. And the women speaker ratios that we looked at, the proportion of women speakers for each conference, is each data point here. The median is the white circle. And as you can probably see here, for almost all fields, the median proportion of women speakers in these conferences is below the base rate for that field. So what this indicates is that you are underrepresenting women in these conferences. If you were representing women to the proportion in which they were present in that field, these should be close together. And that's not what the case is. And in fact, for some fields like math and physics, there's been several conferences that feature absolutely no women speakers. So this is the question, but of course, I've already given you the answers. Are there conferences that feature no women? And these are colloquially called manals. And in fact, like I said, not just math and physics, but also a large proportion of conferences, even in biology, which has the highest base rate, seem to feature no women. And this is quantified here. Again, these are the same fields. We're looking at proportion of conferences here that had base rates, a proportion of women in these conferences that were below the base rates for that field is a blue triangle. And the circle here represents proportion of conferences that had 0 women speakers. And as you can see, all of them had 60% or more conferences that actually featured fewer women than were represented in the field. And several of them had 0 women speakers as well. In fact, if you quantify this, 40% of all conferences, if you look across the board, had no women speakers, and 60% had women speaker ratios below the base rate for that field, indicating that women were being underrepresented in these fields. And if you couple this with the fact that women are already underrepresented in Indian science, this is quite a travesty. So I will keep my talk short so that we have time for discussion, questions, and also feedback from the audience on what you think we should be using our funds and our efforts in furthering BiasWatch India's activities. But the other things that we've been doing in addition to the base rates are providing conference supplements of up to 10,000 rupees for Indian conferences that feature at least 30% women. We've experimented with conducting conferences that feature only women speakers to showcase talented women scientists in India. And the first of this series of conferences, Neuropharm India, was held in April 2021. We'd be really happy to help and support others in the community that would like to do something like Neuropharm India for a different field. Please do get in touch with us if you have any ideas. And most recently, we've started a peer support group Slack as a safe space for discussions and peer mentoring for early career researchers who are women or from marginalized groups. And in the future, we hope to fund women and marginalized students to take up summer internships in labs of women and marginalized scientists. I'd like to end here by acknowledging all the folks who have actually contributed to our data collection for moral support and whatnot. Liba, Metali, Joel, Harsh, Radhini, Ravi, Vasha, Sridhani, Devashish, Abhishek, and of course the EMBO Young Investigator Program for funding, also ALBA Network for supporting Neuropharm India activities. This is our Twitter handle, and this is our website. Please do visit us. You'd find all the data that we have here on our website as well. I look forward to discussions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaishnavi, for a very succinct, but it was nice to see all that data. And I'm very glad to see that you're hoping that people will look at that data and think about what are the policy changes that they should make. The floor is now open for questions. Does anybody have any questions? They can put it in the chat or, oh, Vandana, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, very nice data and very revealing data. I mean, I shouldn't say the data is nice. It's very revealing, but a very nice representation of the data. I have a couple of comments because one of the problems in India is actually the collecting the data.
Yes.
That's always been the problem.
Yes.
So this conference data which you talked about, when you said the first of its kind in April 21, is it only in the period after you have started looking at the data, or you have looked at everything that has also happened before?
No, sorry. The conference that I spoke about in the last slide was a conference that we helped conduct for showcasing women scientists, but we've been collecting data for conferences since June 2020. So since then, we have had over 300 conferences for which we've collected data.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to say that coupled with my first comment, I think the first real comprehensive data has been published in NIAS in the report by, I think, Anita Kurup, Rohini Godbole, and Vinita Bar. And it's actually would be nice to have a report now to see what has actually various measures, how they have affected in the last 10 years. And so that's one thing, and I hope that if you can take up something which is in that getting statistics, that will be good. The second thing I just wanted to say was about the conferences. The Indian Physics Association had set up the Gender in Physics Working Group, and they actually held the first of its kind, the Gender Conference, in 2019.
Yes.
The first meeting was held at actually PFP at ICTS, and the second one was a major conference which was held in Hyderabad University. And there it was actually a mix of a science and social scientists. So that made the thing, but it was showcasing all the women scientists.
That's great.
And in 2017, in March, I think there was also the effort by all the three major Indian journals, that is the productions from the Current Science, Resonance, and the Physics News IPM version, showcase the issues which were done by all women authors. All the three journals did this, and those are available. So that was also again one of the efforts in doing that.
Yeah.
But if you look at the fraction of the authors in this, things is also very small. That is one. And another aspect which you probably should look at is the award nominations.
I mean, if you have anywhere we could get this data publicly, we'd be more than happy to actually do. So we've been wanting to look at proportion of women who've been awarded historically, all these major awards in India, of course. But that data is something, unfortunately, is not publicly available anywhere.
Yeah,
so
I think in India, the efforts have to be made to make the nominations public after the awards are given, so that at least the information is there. Because the many European countries and APS now, some of the awards, they actually do not give the award if the nominations do not have diversity component. The awardee doesn't have to be but they don't give. So I think that's again, I mean, that's another aspect which need to be looked at. Yeah,
absolutely.
So coming back to what Vandana raised, have you compared your data with the prior data that came from Anita and Rohini?
Yes, we have, and it's very similar. I mean, we just wanted to make sure that we had similar data across the board. I think they had a proportion of about 14%, which is not very different from what we have. But we didn't have the kind of granularity from their reports. Perhaps they have it, but we couldn't find that data there, which we wanted to have, because we wanted to break down conferences by fields and therefore compare against fields. So that granularity wasn't available, which is why we couldn't use the number directly.
So you're basically saying in 10 years, we've made progress, perhaps, but not a lot.
I wish the funding agencies, the DST, DBT, whoever wants to, I mean, actually not wants to, whoever should be doing this actually does do this, because I think it's not sustainable if initiatives like ours were the only ones doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Vandana, can I cycle through some of the other raised hands?
Just a small point about conference, that actually the gender audit for the conferences should become a mandatory by the funding agents.
Agreed.
We're still some ways away, but good ideas here. Uma?
Thanks, Sandhya. Thanks, Vaishnavi. I was curious about well, first of all, where do you see this going? It's of course very, amazing that you guys have started it and so on. But do you see some kind of an output in terms of like I think maybe even writing writing it up? Of course, it's great. It's on a website and stuff, but writing it up for some forum for publication, is that something you see? And then what? I think that a lot of times as scientists we say, oh, we want to influence policy, but I think it's important to understand how, like, there have to be possible steps, right? So,
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm pushing you.
No,
but I'm
no,
just
I mean,
curious
we have the same question,
whether-
right? Because we've done this now. And in fact, we're not going to keep doing data collection for Bay States, at least for all the other institutes that exist in India, because we've seen that it's not changing. The number is fairly fixed right now, around 13% is what we're seeing. So I don't think it makes sense for us to continue the Bay State data collection. But what we have been thinking about is exactly what you referred to, which is what happens now, right? So we have recently, actually, this was in September last year, we have formed an advisory board that's advising us on how we could actually take this forward. We would, at this point, what we would really like to do is for us to see any of the essentially the policymakers or the government funding bodies or one of the academies to help us use this data, continue to do the base rate collection, because gender audit is something that is not being done. If it is done, it's not publicly available, which is also, I don't think, acceptable, given that this should be public information. So I think at this point, there needs to be some pressure to try and see if we can get them to take over. We are happy to help them in any way possible, but I think it's important that the funding agencies got involved in this at this stage, because it's not sustainable for us to keep going. Yeah, sorry.
And I noticed that the Indian Academy of Sciences actually had some kind of a statement saying that, oh, everybody should do something.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether you could, because those are just
statements. We've been talking to them. Unfortunately, it's been very slow. We would really like to. We've been trying to speak to different stakeholders and trying to get them on board, but it's been really slow progress. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a pressing need for them to do this at this stage. There's always something more important. I'm not sure when it is that this will become important enough for this to be taken up as something they need to do right now.
I also think that some kind of a publication would be good.
Yes, that's something we've been thinking of, but both Shruti and I are working full time as well. So writing another publication is something that's quite hard for us to do, to find time, but we're definitely thinking about it.
Okay, we'll move to.
May I chime in on the Indian Academy of Sciences stuff?
Okay, Shubha.
Yeah. So I currently chair the Women in Science panel of the Indian Academy of Sciences. It was my committee that put together that document. It was the first time the Academy actually agreed to have such a thing on their website. And it is not only recommendations, but it contains specific implementation steps. There was, in fact, a to-do about whether the implementation should or should not be on the website, and now it is. So there is actually a document with, modalities for implementation for institutions to use, and this is a step. Now, of course, karna padta hai, right? At the same time, the Indian Academy of Sciences had this series of celebrating science and celebrating whatnot. And of course, the celebrating science had no women in it. Yes. Despite my vociferous protests, I was told women will be included in the next session on celebrating diversity. So we're there to celebrate diversity. But, I then suggested, why call it that? Call it celebrating knowledge. Call it celebrating discovery. Call it something that is not, you don't only invite women when you want to showcase women in science. So the same academy that on the one hand is doing this is also doing that. So I slightly feel we can make policies up the wazoo, but until everybody gets on board, when a member of any majority receives an invitation, if they ask to see the speaker list and they offer to step down and suggest somebody else in their place, until we do that, we're not going to actually see change. I think it's up to finally the implementation is at the individual level to sort of be aware of policies and so on.
Very good point, Shubha. Vaishnavi, do you have any thoughts to add?
No, I mean, that's obviously what we also think. I mean, I think we need everybody to actually be invested in this issue to raise their voice, but also to do actionable, to take actionable steps so that, this doesn't continue to be the state of affairs for the rest of eternity. And the one thing that we've also found quite frustrating is whenever we bring up a gender audit, we keep getting told that there's going to be this gati that's going to come up, and it's been in the works, I think, for a while, but we haven't, I'm not sure, maybe I've missed out on it, but I haven't seen anything. And it seems like having that's being used as a crutch anytime questions of numbers of women in science come up. And that's quite frustrating.
Ankuna, can you?
So it's in the same lines of what Shubha said. And, I have been wondering about this for quite a while. Whenever we have these gender bias kind of talks, right? The population of audience that is attending, right, is not reflective of the actual population of women in science. You realize that, right? If everybody was attending in the same numbers, then it would have the same percentage of women and men. This is also a kind of bias, right? Because if we really want to change something, we have to have all genders be there and everybody be there so that we know how to make the change. If only one gender wants to bring in a change, it's never going to happen. So is there a way where we are looking at these, for example, talks and forums that are happening around, and are we finding out who are attending them? Who is in the audience? I mean, who is even worried about this kind of a problem?
Yeah, we did this for our Neuropharm India conference. And if I remember correctly, I think we had about 35% of the audience were identified as men. Although, I mean, of course, that's the opposite.
That's the opposite, right? It should be the equal if everybody is attending.
Yeah,
I mean, if it's neurologists, then they should all be there.
Exactly. But unfortunately, no one can be forced to do this, right? So
we can't force, but it's also something that I think in any case, you're not doing anything to force anyone. So it would be also nice to have that statistics when we are looking at this, because that is also, and that statistics is going to help in the future.
We do for our conferences, of course, but I wouldn't know how to get this for every conference that we're calling out, because of course I don't even know if they keep track of it. So I think it's hard enough to get the speaker.
The registered participants, I don't know, something of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think the individual conference organizers should have the conscience and do it themselves.
Yeah. So Ankuna, I just wanted to raise an issue here, something which you very rightly pointed. So this is something that we have noticed, that people who come to these sorts of events, which are essentially inclusivity events, are often biased towards women as well, even talking about a small community like TIFR. We always try to make it a point to get leadership in the room and try to get as many people as we can. But eventually, you have to want to change. And which is why I think there is a fairness argument to be made, but there's also a larger argument to be made that it is good for science and we all care about science and we should make that, we should have this up and everybody needs to participate in this. So, that's something that it's certainly see across the board, not only at conferences. So our next question comes from Rajalakshmi. Rajalakshmi, you should unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Hi. One thing already people have spoken about it, but I was just thinking, if you do generate a report and then maybe send it around to all the funding agencies and people, in power, there's no guarantee they will read it, but at least it's there on their desk, the information, if they do want to see it and then do something about it. I think it may be nice. Publishing would be a good thing, but I think it the more we bombard them with information, I guess we can also demand that, look, information is being given to you. Please do something about it.
Actually, very recently, I think maybe a couple of years ago, Tuli, they're from University of Pune, I'd like to say, but I may be wrong on that. She had done a small scale study looking at proportion of women in science, but about tens of institutes. I don't remember exactly how many now. And that was out in Current Science, I think. I might be completely wrong, and I can look it up and send it across in a bit. But yeah, so also I think Vandana mentioned, there's been these reports that have been generated almost on a yearly basis. And it just seems like we're throwing it into, I'm being a bit cynical here. I do agree that we should probably collate this information now that we've decided this is where we're stopping with respect to the base data collection at least. We will definitely make a report of some sort. But I just feel like it's a bit more, it would be a bit more effectual if there was some buy-in from an academy, for instance, saying, can you do this report for us because we want to do something about it?
No,
Because,
as we were, Vandana already mentioned, right? We had this conference called Pressing for Progress, which was basically Women in Science Conference. I mean, only Indian Women in Science Conference. Again, there we did try to invite men, and it was like there were enough men in the participation. We consciously invited them.
Yeah.
And even though the general registrations were mostly women, we did invite men, and we tried to keep the percentage close to 50. But Vandana will have the exact data actually. So, but yeah, so that's how the things. See, and then at the end of it, there was like this big book of thing which was generated by a few people and sent to a lot of. I mean, there were people from DST and all sitting there, and they were part of the whole thing. But I don't think they actually looked at the many things later on. But idea is to keep doing it so that eventually maybe something at least will seep in somewhere. Maybe some younger person will at some point look at it and maybe feel bad about it. I don't know. Another one thing which I had, I don't know, it's an information which is hard to get. Often when we have conferences, for example, where I know people, I kind of tell them, point out to them saying that, look, hey, you guys are not calling enough women or things like that. Often the very common, I don't agree with this statement, but often the statement they make is, oh, people don't accept the invitations even if we send them. So that's why we don't have it. So I was just wondering, can we somehow, maybe not publicly, at least ask people to tell how many women did you actually invite? And I don't know, they won't give us the information, but but
we've done that. We're happy to do that on your behalf as well, if you'd like, because we have the BiasWatchIndia handle. We've done that a couple of times, and we've got responses sometimes.
Invite some more people. Can you try that? And then maybe some more people. If I get 5 invitations, I may refuse one. I won't refuse all 5. So.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. We've done this. So we've had instances where we saw no women speakers, and we've asked the organizers, did you actually invite women? And they're like, oh yeah, we invited 2. And they turn out to be 2 of the most, currently the most sought after speakers. Exactly. And of course they can't say yes to everything, and they stopped at that. So, I mean, I think you're right. We just have to keep asking and make sure people think about these things, because I think a lot of times it's not malicious that they're intentionally leading out women.
It's the same problem.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
People
but then
invite people whom they know, and then they only know people whom they meet in conferences. It's just a loop.
But it's as insidious, right? Because just because you don't think about it, you marginalize an entire community. That doesn't make sense.
There's a question from Arnab. Arnab, do you want to unmute yourself and ask, or shall I ask it on your behalf?
I could ask it. I mean, basically, I was looking at the data when you showed it, and it just seems like Myanmar was a complete outlier on the global scale. And is there any understanding of that at all? I mean, it's the last country I would think which, would be peaking on this chart.
I'll have to think about it. So I do not know this data super well, but I do remember a talk where Shobna Narasimhan from JNCSR, she shows this one of these graphs. And I do remember her mentioning that in some countries, science is seen as a woman's job. So there are these anomalies and specific areas of science seen as women's forte. For instance, math. Oh, I'm going to get this totally wrong. I do apologize if I do, but please do take a look at Shobna's talk where she very eloquently puts this. But apparently in Israel, I'd like to say, there's more women in math than men, because math is seen as a soft science. So there are these gendered notions of what women should be doing and not. And so I guess that could explain it, but I do not know. I must confess, I do not know what this is. It could be one of those things.
All right, thanks.
Or maybe math is something where you can do the work anywhere. And so it's compatible with having a family life.
Perhaps, yeah.
Okay, so then next question, which is on the chat box, is Sugra. Sugra, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? I'm sorry, I will get to everybody, if but there are some things which came early.
Sandhya, can you ask, because I'm traveling?
Okay, definitely. So what Sugra asks is, thank you for what she says is, thank you for your talk. And please do elaborate. Sugra, if you can mute yourself, that would be good. Please do elaborate on your definition of marginalized.
Yeah, so we are taking a broad stance here. So one thing that we're conscious of is the fact that, of course, women are not the only marginalized community. I mean, we are not a minority, but we are marginalized in science. But that is not the only community that is marginalized. In fact, at the intersections of gender, socioeconomic status, caste, class, and minority genders, other minority genders, you see that it becomes much, much harder for folks in science. And so we're taking a conscious stance to also try and include in our best capacity as we can, marginalized communities in BiasWatch India's activities going forward. It's of course not going to be possible, or I'm not sure if it's impossible, but it's not going to be easy for us to do the same kind of data collection, of course, because it is not easy for us to identify marginalized communities if they don't want to be identified. We don't want to do that for them either, because of course that could also lead to repercussions. So we can't do the base rate collections, but what we are trying to do is actually create at least a space where we do welcome them and hopefully take them also forward with women.
How has that worked? How has that effort worked? Have people sort of come forward?
I think we've had some success, but I don't think, honestly, I don't think we're doing enough. I think Shruti and I should be doing more. We've been a bit busy focusing only on women in science, and I think that's unfair to the other communities that do need also help. And in fact, we'd really like to partner with other communities to help them with BiasWatch India's current success, at least that we've had with reaching to several people in academia using our Twitter followers primarily. We're happy to share the platform with marginalized communities. It's been hard, and if there's anybody in this forum who would like to get in touch with us to see how best we could help you, please do come forward and write to me or message me, DM me on Twitter. That'd be great.
Ullas, sorry, it took me a while to get to you.
No, I was just, I realized that I should have typed it instead of raising my hand. So, yeah. Vaishnavi, I'm just wondering, what would it take for a lot of us that there is a bias against is very obvious. In fact, thanks to you, your data does show that does show the skew. But I'm just wondering, would it be very provocative to suggest where we could probably ask leading institutions to sign a declaration of sorts to say that whenever meetings are organized by the leading institutions, they will accommodate women with certain percentage, as ideally definitely above the base rate, but as high as possible. Is it too provocative to even propose this? Because I would assume that there are people who will be sensitive to do this, and I would like to believe that some leaders would be okay to sign a declaration like that. I mean, otherwise we keep throwing this data, like you said, I don't see anything happening. And in fact, without that data, many of us are aware that this keeps on happening and has continued forever, right? So is it possible to get a declaration like that? And the second thing is, the other way to fix a long term is to showcase some of our more younger women colleagues right from their PhD days across different fora. I know the Women in Science also tries to do that, but maybe ensure that some of these conferences also feature women or younger colleagues, PhD students who are girls, so that they also get the confidence, and over a period there'll be some impact. So I'm just wondering, we have to do something drastic. Everybody, I mean, there might be intentions, but sometimes for whatever reason may or may not work out. So declaration is something that I thought, would it be too provocative? I don't know. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think if there are any institutions that have the courage to actually do something of that sort, that'd be great to see, because one of the things that we've been toying with is the idea of a declaration of some sort. We were thinking of it more in context of individuals. So predominantly, we want to see scientists who identify as men signing a declaration saying, if I'm invited to a conference, I will not participate unless I know that there are at least 30% women on the speakers list, for instance. If individuals can sign this, we're happy to maintain a list of people who sign this on our website for others to see and to follow the lead, so that we at least account for the people that will actually act as allies and take that step forward in terms of actual actionable data, actionable steps. But with respect to institutions, I think there is going to be backlash. I mean, at least this is my gut feeling, that there's going to be backlash unless there is significant investment from the upper management to say that this is what we're going to do. It's going to be hard to get the buy-in, at least as far as I can see. But that would be great. If any institutes are willing to do that, if the IFI is willing to do that, that'd be awesome. Maybe set an example.
Yeah. It has to be supported from the top. Otherwise, you can't make these very dramatic changes. Absolutely. It comes everywhere, and it doesn't only conferences. It's not only who you get into your graduate program, whether you support them. It's who you hire, how you promote, how you support that career through that entire pipeline. And it, as you very rightly said, it's not just gender. There are many marginalized communities, and we, as a group of citizens of this country, we need to be very sensitive about this.
Absolutely.
issue.
Agree.
So there is Aditi.
I think there was a second question from Ullas, which I'll very briefly respond to, about younger colleagues in conferences. I think absolutely any kind of exposure for women scientists is great. But I also think that that is definitely one measure that has to be taken. But I don't know if that is what's keeping them behind in terms of progressing through academia if they do wish to. There are other, unfortunately, systemic issues that others in this audience are also have written about actually quite a bit, which keep them from furthering their career in academia from the postdoc level to the assistant professor and so on. So I think exposure is great, regardless of which level they are in. I think getting them on a platform, getting them a platform to speak on would be great. But whether that would take care of other issues that come down the road is a different question.
Has to be addressed at multiple levels. Here, Aditi, do you want to ask your question? Or should I read it out? Aditi Muralidhar.
Hi, am I audible?
Fairly.
Yeah. Okay, hi, Vaishnavi, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to add one point, this discussion that came up, having sort of declarations and so-called extreme steps. I do see one problem there is that when you have limited number of women in any department, say, even if we're talking about committees or panelists or whatever, what happens is that if the same limited number of women are now mandated into everything, then it actually ends up giving them more, work, and it skews the even the amount of work that they get. So I'm not always sure that the idea of having mandatory measures will help. But however, the idea that you proposed just now that, one can have allies who come voluntarily forward and, help out, that would be really good. That was one point. And the question I had is that during your study, have you actually come across some very interesting actions, formal or informal, taken up by scientific institutes to address this underrepresentation of non-dominant genders? Something that has caught your attention?
Yeah, I mean, to your first point, you're right. I think that is a hard situation for women scientists to be in, because if you do require a specific proportion of women to be in every single panel, that obviously makes no sense for an institution that let's say has 10% women. So I don't know if I have a great answer for that. But to your second point, there are several things that have been done elsewhere in the world that seems to have helped address this issue of bringing in numbers. So there's, of course, affirmative action, which has worked to some extent in the US. And I am for affirmative action. The one thing that I don't, and I mean, that's been a policy that's been followed elsewhere as well, not just in the US. The one thing that I do find is lacking after having got folks into the university or institute, the environment that they're in, it hasn't changed, unfortunately. So it's about, at this point, the focus is on increasing numbers without changing the environment in which they're conducting their research, their science. And there's still this feeling of not being welcome. And it's something that is constant, that is daily, which can essentially sap your enthusiasm for science, right? And so I don't see enough being done in context of creating an inclusive environment at the workspace. I could say that for many institutes across the world, and a lot of colleagues agree with me when it comes to who are not based in India or Australia right now, but elsewhere in the world, they agree with me that this is one thing which is lacking. So there has been a lot of steps being taken to change the numbers at this point in time, but not enough being done to create an inclusive environment, which is where I think India can learn from this and do both things simultaneously. It's not just about creating, although coming from somebody who's actually counting numbers, it might seem a little disingenuous, but it's not just about creating, it's not just about increasing the numbers of people from different communities in your workspace, but providing them a inclusive workspace where they actually feel like they are welcome. And so I think India can leverage this and probably start doing both of these together, because of course we don't have the numbers yet. And of course we don't have the inclusive environment either. So why not do both of them at the same time? I think I gave you a really long-winded answer for something you didn't ask me, but I hope that answered your question in some way.
Yes, thank you so much.
Apratim?
Yes, Sandhya. So, hi Vaishnavi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Thanks.
Okay, sorry. I have a bit of a rambling point, but I promise I'll get to the point very soon. So I once was in one of the ICERs, and a woman faculty colleague of mine got a call saying that, yeah, we need you to be on this panel. We need a woman for the panel. So which seems so perfunctory, right? So because you need a woman for the panel. So we do many things, but we do it in a rather perfunctory manner. So a few years back, in the December of 2018, in the Indian Society for Developmental Biologists meeting, Shubha and I think Jyots, that they had this panel again about women in science. And the thing is, a key point which emerged there, memory that I have from that is that if there is to be positive affirmative action, actually from many of the women students, there was a lot of pushback because they feel that it will devalue them somehow as scientists, because in India, of course, we have this loaded word called quota or and things like that, right? So there is this fear that it somehow devalues you as a scientist. So we also, of course, in our institute, the base rate is quite poor. And we are actively trying to improve that. But the thing is, how to do that? The thing is, probably one has to go the extra mile, right? So in that discussion also at that NHTB meeting, what emerged was that in the conferences, the base rate is meaning the participation of women in conferences is lower than the base rate, right? That is in part because of the invitations that you sent out, but also because of the facilities that you have at the conferences, which sometimes do not let women participate as effectively, right? So that in itself can push it down below the fraction of women that you have in the scientific community, in that community, right? So, but on the other hand, the way to do this perhaps is by going that extra mile, because as soon as you say anything about affirmative action, I remember even the women students, they themselves were very much, there is a sense that it somehow would devalue them as scientists. So I don't have a good answer to this, but one has to do something. But what do you think?
I think this is something, of course, that comes up quite frequently when we have these discussions, right? But one thing perhaps you could reframe it as is essentially the data. What I haven't shown today is the data of a proportion of women who graduate with PhDs in science every year, right? So across the board, it's about 40%. given that that number is so large, 40% of women, of the people that were awarded PhDs in science were women, and the fact that further from there, if you look at the postdoc level or the assistant professor level, that there's this massive drop in numbers, it actually shows that there's actually a quota for men, no? So perhaps that helps them reframe them. It's actually not a quota at all.
Yeah, it's not. But the thing is, the students feel that somehow it will.
Perhaps you could reframe it in that context. Yeah, because the numbers are just not adding up.
Yeah.
Some years ago, Bhaswati had invited for International Women's Day Dr. Anita Kurup at NIAS, who is a professor who was looking at this sort of data. And she raised this very interesting point that people often talk about whether you're meritorious and what is your quality. And she made this point that the way people judge quality and whether you are really smart or have been really productive or really good is also it's not necessarily objective. Do you have a take on that, Vaishnavi?
Absolutely. I mean, merit is meaningless when you're thinking about it in context of all the inequities that you have starting from when you're born, right? So nobody is born equal. And those inequities keep adding up and have this huge effect in your trajectory at the end of the day. So if you are to claim that you have merit just because you were able to top an exam, it doesn't seem right that you can claim that when you've had different opportunities compared to somebody else, when you've had different circumstances compared to somebody else. So I think as scientists, we do get caught up in this idea of merit, which to me, I mean, I haven't always had this view, of course. I've been educating myself and trying to understand how all of these work in the past 10 years or so. And for me, it seems super shallow to say that we go by merit alone. And that means nothing, because you're essentially selecting for somebody who essentially looks like you, who has had an experience like yours, who's had the same life history as yours. And that's what you're calling merit, which is not how it should be defined. So, I mean, I'm getting a bit more passionate about this, but I can speak at great length about this, but perhaps I'll end there.
Lamia, you.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. So the numbers are saddening, but I wanted to ask whether you try to approach agencies which assess institutions so that if they have a mandate which requires a certain percentage of women to be professors in an institution. So I know of NAC and the UGC being one of, being two of those bodies who do that, who go and assess and accredit institutions. And because this is necessary for institutions, because the score that they give highlights the quality status of the institute. So if this is a part of their, set of things that, they need to pick whether an institute is, so having that criteria included.
Yeah. And, sorry. You have another question?
Yeah, I had another suggestion also, which is if you could have a list of institutes, of all the institutes in India, the list that you already do, with the percentage of women professors in different departments, and kind of correlate the numbers of these, the percentage of women with the quality of work that the institute puts out. So I think it's kind of an awareness to show that they are equally at par with all the other institutions. Otherwise,
actually, you'd be surprised to know. I mean, I'll tell you what we actually found out. But to the first question, which was to look at UGC and see if that can be So the thing is, UGC actually, I'm not sure about UGC, but the NAAC rankings, right? Or am I getting this wrong? Something else. The rankings that come out, whichever one that is. They do have a score for gender equity. I don't know what they call it exactly, but it's a very, very small proportion of the scores that they get for other things, for other criteria. And so it has very little effect on the end score. Of course, that's something that can be changed. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no connect to the UGC or NAAC or any of these institutes. We did have talks with DST, DVT, folks from the academies and so on. I mean, I haven't really suggested this to them, but what I'd really like to suggest to them is to say that they will discontinue funding to institutes that do not have a proportion of women, which is of course never going to happen, but perhaps that's something that they could think of as a drastic measure. That would be great if it happens, but I don't think it's going to. The second question was about, yes, the proportion of women in these premier institutes, right? So of course, there's no way for us to objectively say which one's a quality institute or not. So we're going by the rankings here. And if we look at the top 20 institutes, TFR of course features there, IISc also features there. Unfortunately, the proportion of women here is lower than the rest of the places. And unfortunately, that comes back to the question of merit that Sandhya was mentioning just a while ago. It seems to be the case that places that are seen as more prestigious favor merit and therefore leave out women. So there you go.
Thank you.
Manoj?
Yeah, I just want to make a point that a few others have already touched on this, perhaps. Just wanted to say that the gender inequity, I think it's most people more or less agree on the fact that there is gender inequity in Indian academia, whether it's in recruitment or retention or advancement, and statistics presented by your team and many others have amply demonstrated it. And I think people are cognizant of gender inequity and are trying to do something about it, but it's not very clear to them why exactly. And I think one of the reasons for this is that often the bias is at work, but often it's not very explicit. And it's not overt, but it often operates at a subtle level. I mean, so we all have heard of this unconscious bias and implicit association, etc. So gender bias often works that way subtly and then favors men regardless of gender. So as a result, I think what happens is there is a general sort of what's called a chilly climate, a kind of an agglomeration of informal practices and implicit policies, which has this cumulative effect, which work to the disadvantage of women. So I think it's also important for institutes to look within itself and try to see the culture and practice of science. And an institute cannot just remain passively objective and then say that, okay, the larger society and we can't do much about it. I think institutes will also have to be proactive about this and take a closer look at within themselves and see what exactly are the reasons for this. So I think problems. I think nobody are going to argue with the numbers anymore, but it's just about how does one go about it. I mean, so then including the more number of women in talks and I think certainly helps. There's no doubt about it. But I think the problems are deeper and slightly.
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, there's no use waiting for society to catch up and say we will change when the society changes, right? Because there are very specific recommendations that, in fact, we collated all of the recommendations that have been given over the years by several task forces, starting from 2008, 9. I mean, there's a few different ones. You can find them on our website. We have listed down all of the individual action points that were recommended. And these are very insightful and quite forward-looking points that were made more than 10 years ago now, right? None of them, almost none of them have been implemented yet. So it's not that there is even a dearth of recommendations that have been given by our scientists, some of whom are in the audience right now. The problem has been with the implementation, as is the case with several things in academia elsewhere as well. So there's nothing new for us to add here other than to say, do these things that you asked your scientists to look up and to recommend years ago now. And that's where essentially there's a block. Absolutely.
Let's go beyond words. Shubha?
Absolutely.
Thanks. This is a very, very useful discussion. I hope, I don't know, are we taking notes? This is actually Okay, I wanted to go back to representation in committees, because honestly, that's how younger people feel recognized and included, and people who want to contribute. And I mean, right from students, I think it's quite important for a student to be asked to be on a committee, young faculty and so on. And I believe Apratim talked about the committee representational issue. I have something slightly delicate to say here. When people form committees, they think of people they are comfortable with. Okay, that's a reasonable trait. Why would you want somebody you're uncomfortable with? But there is the gendered business, because the bandwidth of personality types that you're comfortable with is very narrow for women than for men. I mean, men on committees, I've seen people jump up and down, this and that, things that would have certainly gotten women thrown off of committees. But women are subjected to a more rigorous likability check. I'll just say that, right? So some women get oversubscribed, and a whole range just don't fit in that bandwidth. So when we're asking, say, students to be on committees or young faculty, one suggestion I have is to ask a wider range of women and question, okay, if one ever calls this out, the immediate answer you get is, oh, I didn't exclude her out because she's a woman. And that phrasing is actually the root of the problem. Nobody sits and goes, she's a woman, let me hate her. Nobody actually, the point is a guy with the same characteristics would have been in your committee. So that phrasing, this I didn't do it because she's a woman, that's the phrasing we have to attack and address and change. So that's my contribution.
Absolutely. Sanjay, you're muted, I think.
Yes. We have gone well past the hour in Australia. Vaishnavi, it's pretty late in the night. So unless there's a pressing, burning question or a point that you would like to discuss. Oh, Amon. Yes, go ahead, Amon.
The IUPAC, which is the International Union for Pure and Applied Physics, when they sponsor a conference, they put a condition that a certain fraction of speakers must be women.
Yeah.
I do not know if many other institutions, any other funding.
EMBO does that as well. Yeah, EMBO does that as well. Yeah.
And whether it's something that is something one can recommend to sort of all funding agencies for conferences, saying that this is a place where you can just start with.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. European Molecular Biology Organization does that as well. So they've had this for many years now. And they do not fund conferences unless you have at least 30% women. At least the last time I checked was 30%. They may have increases now, but yeah, that's a good point.
This is for multiple. It's in the US, it's in Canada, it's in the UK. That's very widespread, by the way.
Yeah.
Sorry, can we implement it at home in our colloquium series? Haha.
I think there are many places in which TIFR could.
I mean, let's walk the talk. No, it's so simple.
We could also fund internally our conferences, and we could make that same request. So there are many places in which institutionally we can and should improve and can do so. So those are very good points. But I think we are really at 5:12, almost 5:15. And thank you, Vaishnavi. Thank you very much. I know that the data has been around for a while and lots of us have seen it. It's always good to revisit what has happened in the past. So we know data from 10 years ago, and to see how far have we come since that point. How far have we come from the recommendations that were made, such that each generation of scientists and each generation of underrepresented minorities does not have the same conversations again and again, and we move it forward. And I hope that small discussions like this contribute to the sensitizing the community and helping make change. Gradual be it. Thank you very much, Vaishnavi, and thank you all of you for participating and coming, and thank you all the centers for co-hosting this talk.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Prof. Vaishnavi. Also, thank you, Sandhya. I also want to steal just a minute to announce the next talk, the very next talk that is going to be next week on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. We have another speaker, Dr. Pratibha Jolly, going to speak on Gati, moving needle. I'm sure that it's again going to be equally interesting, just like what we had today. So I request all of you again to come back and attend the next week talk as well. Thank you very much.